pagans are very pragmatic. They were able to, like, if you see this a lot in the Old Testament, if your nation or tribe was conquered by another nation or tribe, then you assumed that the gods of that nation were more powerful, and you added them to your pantheon.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd swap and pick and choose and blend, and it was kind of commercialistic or what's the word I'm looking for? Cosmopolitan. It was cosmopolitan. And I've encountered, this was already happening at the tail end of the millennial generation before COVID. And I'm not saying COVID was the pivot factor here, but it kind of like ushered in the switch in generations because there was a year gap there. And I was gone in Ohio for a year. So it really, when I came back, it was the new generation. But this was already beginning before, where you would find the wildest combinations of ideas, ideologies, religious traditions, and there was no guarantee at all between one student at UWM and the next that if they labeled themselves as, unless it was a very tightly defined tradition like Islam or Mormonism or one of the cults maybe, you weren't going to find consistency from almost anyone. If you really got down to a discussion with them of the particulars of what they believed and why they believed. If they said they're Protestant, Catholic, well, those were kind of the big two, or even atheist or secular. There are many different flavors of that as there are on that soda machine they have now, where you blend the soda with the spritzes of flavor. And that probably doesn't even begin to cover it, but it's the basic idea.
Yeah, which is interesting. And I feel like, I think the most, I don't know, the saddest thing as a Christian about this is, well, and this is where I'm optimistic about this, and I can close here too, is when you had the nominal Christianity, I think we can both agree you had a deadening of the gospel. You had a domestication of Christ. And I think that's probably the worst thing Christianity can be, is domesticated, because Christianity was incompatible with the pagan religions, because they said, no, Christ isn't another deity you can tack on to the end there. Christ is the individual who crushes the heads, right? It's one or the other. That's the bargain that Yahweh always made with his people, was saying, I cannot be tacked on to the next pantheon, right? And so that Christian impulse was what revolutionized the world, because the Christians came to Rome, and through peaceful means, it was the blood of the martyrs in certain ways that drowned the emperors, right? It was incompatible, right? And I think this is a cause to be optimistic about, is because we are encountering a generation that are unchurched. They don't know the gospel. And so we have a new opportunity to evangelize, as opposed to people who have heard it, they've experienced it, they've maybe even lived it, and then they've rejected it. That's a lot more of a disadvantage to be at than someone who has no idea what you're talking about, right? It's the opportunity for a completely new day in apologetics and in evangelization.
And I want to pick up that apologetics point on the next episode, but I'll wrap this up then by saying that in the cycle of history, you have ironically begun to come full circle. I wouldn't say we've come full circle, because it will vary widely based on the region of the country that you're in, or even the part of the city that you're in, or the suburb. I mean, in the countryside, there's still a lot of God Bless America, and a very much more conservative, rural, traditional culture. But demographically, that segment of the population is considerably older and a vast minority.
Sure.
But I'm just saying, I don't know if it's right, if it's quite accurate to say that we're there yet, but we're arriving there rapidly.
Yeah.
And the ironic circle here of history is that what made the early Christians stand out, and you see this in the lives of the apostles themselves, is you had someone like Felix with Paul, who listened, the governor of whatever province Paul was in Acts, and he said, Paul, I think you've gone mad with your much learning. Because Paul came from Tarsus, a cosmopolitan intersection of the empire's culture. He was trilingual, I believe, maybe more than that. Very well educated in both the Hebrew tradition and the Greco-Roman tradition. And so Festus, or Felix, one of the two, he was looking at this man, and he just scratched his head like, I don't know what to make out of this man. He's so eloquent, he's so educated, but he's basically just babbling nonsense. And the Greeks had this idea of the mad philosopher that they actually admired. There's a legendary, possibly apocryphal, like not real kind of anecdote about Alexander, who that might have been Dionysus. There was a philosopher who Alexander, the conqueror of the world, approached him and he said, and the guy's like sunbathing, and the philosopher says to him, "Get out of my sun." And of course, all of Alexander's goons are expecting him to just impale this man. And Alexander's response supposedly was, if I weren't Alexander, I would be Diogenes. And so a person or a philosopher or a teacher who was willing to just say crazy sounding things and stand by it at risk of their own life, the pagan Greco-Roman culture admired that. And there are so many early martyrologies that we're probably both familiar with of Christians who the governor would say, renounce Christ or go to the lions, renounce Christ or your head's off in 5 minutes. And the Christians would just boldly and yet compassionately say, you hear stories about people in the early church, one of them, who was it? Papias, I think, who said, 80 years he's been faithful to me. How can I turn on him now? And then they took that 8-year-old man, and I think they either burned him or threw him to the lions. And how many people in that crowd watched this decrepit old man, who might have had a life of ease and luxury for his final days, give that up and suffer the fate of an 80-year-old man in the arena.
Right.
And how many of them said, well, wow, I don't see that every day.
Right, exactly.
And I think, like you were saying, there's an opportunity now for Christians in particular, not to be preachy about this, but to be the standout again. And in a world full of people who are probably just as confused and lost philosophically with no real definition in life, they can look at us and be like, what? Well, that's strange. I don't get what you're saying, but hopefully they'll say we're really nice and you really seem to stick to it, even though people kind of laugh at you behind your back. What's up with that?
Yeah.
So that's a good note to end this one on.